Library. We work in collaboration with people across the university, both within and outside of the library, on their projects that end up in the digital repository service. So if you have any questions that do not get answered at the end of the presentation, or if you would like to collaborate, please don't hesitate to reach out. My email is in this initial slide. Okay, so today I'm going to share practical strategies you can implement for your own work to find resources, generate documentation, and use tools based on reparative and inclusive metadata processes. So the presentation was inspired by a 1.5-year project initiated by the Metadata unit, which is the unit I manage within Digital Production Services. So special shout out to Emily Allen and Chelsea McNeil within my unit who collaborated on this project with me, as well as Kim Kennedy and Sarah Sweeney who work within our department and collaborated as well. So our efforts were in response to a recognition that our metadata creation and assessment practices have real consequences for how communities are represented and how users engage in the collections. As far as this session structure, we will move from conceptual foundations to practical documentation strategies. Then I will demonstrate the MARMAT tool specifically with real world data, and we'll conclude with some implementation guidance for y'all. So there's a lot to cover today. Some things I might not go into the detail you would like to hear. So if there's something you want a deeper dive on, please don't hesitate to ask at the end of the presentation, or as I mentioned before, contact me via email. Side note, I have many windows open, so I cannot see if anyone raises their hand or has any pressing issues or concerns. So please don't hesitate to unmute and shout out if, I don't know, for example, the slides disappear during the presentation. Okay. So first off, let's talk about the foundations of inclusive and reparative metadata. So I'll start with defining our terms, right? So inclusive metadata is a proactive approach to representing diverse communities accurately and respectfully in new cataloging work. So it focuses on using appropriate and community preferred terminology. It avoids assumptions and stereotypes whenever possible, and considers who is represented and how, and centers the needs of users from diverse communities. Reparative metadata addresses and corrects existing harmful or biased description. So this acknowledges historical harm is embedded in archival and special collections and their descriptions, and it works to remediate problematic language and systemic bias in legacy metadata. Okay, so what are the problems that inclusive and reparative practices ameliorate, right? So traditional cataloging practices were developed within systems of power that marginalize many communities. So Sanford Berman, a librarian whose research and work with ALA, as well as a host of other organizations, led to significant changes in many library practices, including Library of Congress subject headings, said it best when he said that traditional cataloging practices center Europeans and North Americans, white-hued, at least nominally Christian, and preferably Protestant in faith, comfortably situated in the middle and higher income brackets, largely domiciled in suburbia, fundamentally loyal to the established order, and heavily imbued with the transcendent, incomparable glory of Western civilization. Further, it reflects a host of untenable, indeed obsolete and arrogant assumptions. So, I mean, as you can tell from that description, traditional cataloging leaves out many communities and removes focus and avoids correct terminology for a host of reasons. So often, not only the metadata, but historical materials themselves contain harmful language that, if reproduced uncritically, perpetuates harm. So a couple examples of issues we encounter in both the historical materials and the metadata descriptions is aggrandizing language for historic persons, often white men, including colonizers and enslavers, euphemistic terms that either obscure violence and or perpetuate stereotypes, outdated or offensive terminology for marginalized identities, and what catalogers often refer to as minoritization, which is making identities determinative in analysis in a way that removes minorities from general stories. Okay, so why is learning about this and creating institutional documentation important? So it matters for your users because essentially inclusive and reparative metadata is more accurate, right? Historical description often contains bias, which is antithetical to the mission of appropriate descriptive practice. It also causes less harm, right? So work that better supports the needs of your users and encourages engagement with diverse communities will improve the quality and limit harm of your metadata. It also matters for your project and your team because individual catalogers need consistent guidance and support. Documentation creates accountability and sustainability beyond any single staff member, and maintaining your documentation demonstrates an institutional commitment to this work. Okay. So how did my team develop institutional documentation? So our initial start really was responding with the availability of some newly organized resources. So DLF, or the Digital Library Federation, their cultural assessment working group created an inclusive metadata toolkit. We use this toolkit and the associated resource list as the foundation for our work. The resource list has 100+ resources organized by a couple different themes that include some foundational concepts, relations to specific communities, and discussions of practical applications. In response to this, my team established monthly what we refer to as content clubs, where each team member selected a reading from the resource list and shared the reading with some insights. So the goal was to develop a shared understanding before we began creating official documentation. So each meeting focused on specific themed sections of the toolkit so we could discuss how our various readings shared or deviated in perspective. We also created a collaborative note-taking document that built collective knowledge. And the hope was that this document would reveal what local documentation could be generated from this learning process. So why does a collaborative approach matter? No single person holds all the knowledge or perspective needed for this work. Discussion really helped us process difficult material and challenged individual assumptions. It also really built team investment in the resulting documentation via creating a space for vulnerability and learning. So in the end, we're at the creation point. We ended up with 3 main documents. So one is the introductory document, which was really meant to build shared understanding, and its priority is really in onboarding new staff and establishing a shared conceptual foundation. So the key content in this document involves clear definitions of inclusive and reparative metadata and discusses some grounding principles such as care and empathy, respect, and transparency. It also links to other resources related to this project work to introduce people to the constellation of available local and institutional documents and provides guidance on collaboration, intentional practice, and self-care while conducting this work. Our second main document is an element or general and element specific cataloging guidance. So this is the most practical application and involves instructions that can be used as regular reference for daily metadata and cataloging work. So the structure of this document is kind of in 3 parts. One is a resource list that links both to our local documents as well as helpful descriptive practices from other institutions. The second part is general guidelines that covers the foundational approaches and gives some clear guidelines on how to apply those foundations. So this includes some writing style guidance, such as how to use active voice and direct language, how to avoid aggrandizing terms and subjective descriptions, and how to keep language accessible by avoiding jargon. It also talks about a couple key principles, so how to describe power relationships when contextually important, how to respect self-identification by using terms communities use for themselves, and how to cite sources clearly. The third section of this document is the element-specific section. So this is really the media section of the document. It's based on a table that's based on local metadata standards. So locally, we use MODS XML, which is very similar to DC, if you're more familiar with that. And it includes, or Dublin Core, it includes directions and examples for titles, abstracts, names, notes, subject, language, and genre elements. A couple strategies covered are how to handle harmful language from sources, so when to quote directly versus paraphrase versus omit, how to provide context without reproducing harm, how to use notes and genre terms to acknowledge problematic original language while providing improved description. It also talks about how to generate aboutness. So that can be via subjects by addressing gaps in Library of Congress subject headings for marginalized communities, and how to supplement LCSH with more specific or accurate terms. Thirdly, it discusses how to avoid minoritization when adding titles, names, and selecting relevant subjects while balancing users who may want to search by specific identities. The third document is a special topics guide, which is really deep dives into specific communities. And the purpose of this document is to direct users to export resources when working with materials about specific communities. So that's organized by community or identity, such as, Indigenous peoples, LGBTQ+ resources, disability communities, religious minorities, and links to writings by members of those communities. It also points to institutional examples of good practice. So why is this important? The element-specific guidance document gives great practical advice, but sometimes projects or individuals need a deeper understanding when engaging with new collections or materials. It also points towards communities' own voices about how they want to be represented. And lastly, it really helps our team identify where our knowledge gaps are, and via that reminds us to keep learning and reminding ourselves that this is not a one-time fix. We have to continually engage with new resources. Okay, so now that I've discussed our local processes, let's briefly go over how this could be applied to your needs. And that's mostly by asking questions and continued learning, right? So in order to implement strategies for your project, I think you first need to assess your current practices and context. And as I mentioned, that's by asking questions. So some of the questions I would start with is, what does your existing metadata documentation look like? Are there known issues with legacy description in your collections? What expertise exists on your team? What knowledge gaps need filling? What are your resource constraints, right? Time, staff, funding, and have communities or individuals raise concern about how they're represented in your collections. I think once you answer those questions, you will know how and when to start building team knowledge through collaborative learning. As I've mentioned before, don't expect one person to become an expert or carry all responsibility for this work. I cannot recommend starting a reading or learning group via the DLF toolkit or other resources, right? So, and I really want to stress that you need to create organized space and time for discussion and processing, and really share responsibility for exploring different topics. We really learned a lot by discussing where readings and our own thoughts about things really deviated from each other, and that helped a lot in collaboration. And then lastly, you really want to document this learning as you go, because as I mentioned, this really becomes the foundation for your project or institutional guidance. So once you've gotten that foundation started, how do you create iterative documentation tailored to your specific context, right? So don't try to create comprehensive documentation all at once. I would start with areas where you encounter issues most frequently. I would also consider what format works for you. That was a really big discussion in our group so that we could make the documents as practical as possible, right? Like, do you want to use Google Docs? Do you all work in GitHub? Do you want to put it in your local SharePoint? What format will be the easiest to consult? Also use real examples from your collections in the documentation. Number one, I think this stress tests your documentation. And number two, it really helps you test your guidance with actual cataloging work and refine as you move forward. And I cannot recommend involving all your team members in this process. My team has actually learned quite a bit by kind of testing this documentation with new staff members to see where they have issues or or misunderstanding. Okay. So you have these documents and your associated practices established. How do you survey existing descriptions to check for harmful metadata creation? Okay, so now we get to talk about tools. I want to be clear, there are other tools, and I have linked some in the links I added in the chat, but the tool I will be discussing and demoing today is called MARMAT. It has very simple setup and application, and I think that I've found that to be great for folks new to seeing metadata as data, and I also think the output of this tool provides a great framework for interpretation. Okay, so what is MARMAT? MARMAT is a metadata remediation and assessment tool. It's developed by librarians at University of Utah's J. Willard Marriott Library. It's free, it's open sourced, it's continually updated, and it's designed to specifically support reparative metadata work. How does it work? It compares existing metadata against curated lexicons of potentially problematic terms. The output is a report that identifies the flagged term, the metadata element that contains that term, the relevant lexicon category, and all of that is organized by unique identifiers that you input for each item that you're testing against. So what this tool does not do is make changes automatically, right? Reparative and inclusive metadata really requires human interpretation and decision making. So I want to be clear that this tool is for you to find potential problematic terms, right? Just a term's presence does not mean that it needs to be changed or your description needs to be rewritten. It really is just an indicator of something that should be reviewed and considered. Okay, so what's in the lexicon? Racial euphemisms and outdated terminology, terms related to slavery and incarceration, disability-related language, gender and LGBTQ+ identity language, mental illness terminology, aggrandizing language, and terms related to violence and oppression. And why does lexicon-based detection matter or function well? Legacy collections and projects can often contain thousands or tens of thousands of records. Even if it's not that number, the amount of description in each individual record makes going through them, makes going through every record or every description in detail very time consuming. I believe MARMAT really helps prioritize which records need human attention in a systematic way rather than using an ad hoc approach to remediation. So what do you need before you get started with MARMAT? You need to make sure you have Python downloaded on your computer. There's a link to that at the top of the chat. You also need to download and know where MARMAT is on your computer. You will understand a little bit more why once we do the demo, but you really need to know the file path to the program and to the main Python file to run MARMAT. You also have to have your metadata ready, right? So your metadata has to be in a CSV spreadsheet. I want to be clear, if you ever need help in transforming your metadata into a functional CSV or spreadsheet, please don't ever hesitate to reach out to myself or to someone in my department. That really is a specialty of something we do really regularly with our project partners. Your spreadsheet also needs to have, as I mentioned before, each row has to represent an individual record, and that row has to have a unique identifier so that the output report can say this exact record has this exact problem, right? In addition, each column needs to be unique, and you have to know what column you want to test or which columns you want to test. Additionally, you have to have your lexicon ready, right? So you have to make sure that your lexicon has all the terms you want to search for, and you have to know what categories you want to search against. If you look through the lexicon in the future, you'll notice that not every category is something you'll want to test against every project or collection. You'll see that when I do the demo. Last but not least, you want to know some other locations. So you want to know where your input files are. I suggest saving your input files for every test so you could start collecting statistics and compare changing lexicons and collections over time. You also want to know where you want your output to go. All right, so a little bit of context about the data set we'll be using. The data set is based on records that were generated by AI for 573 photographs from the Boston Globe Archives. The selection criteria for the photographs and the associated records are for images representing diverse subjects with particular focus on content identified via the archival folder descriptions as potentially sensitive. That includes persons from underrepresented or marginalized communities, civil action or protest activities, and individuals engaged in criminalized behavior. The metadata included in this demo will be transcriptions of the text visible on the back of the photographs, plus AI-generated titles and abstracts created using the Gemini model. Okay, now it is time for the demo. Give me just a second. All right, so first I'm going to show you how my files are organized. As you can see, I keep MARMAT in a folder on my desktop. for easy terminal navigation, which I will show you in a second. I like to make subfolders for every time I run it so that I can compare lexicons and save outputs within their larger context. This will also be useful as I rerun and rerun the same metadata. So as you can see, I have a demo documents folder set up, which we will be using today. So here is my input. And so as you can see, I have my unique identifier for every item. Here's the titles and abstracts generated by Gemini. Photographers and dates are also things we asked Gemini to generate. We will not be testing that today. And then last but not least, here's the transcriptions on the back of the photographs, right? Now I will show you the lexicon. So here is that. As I said, this lexicon is really based on a DLF, or sorry, one provided by Marmat. And so you have your terms here, right? And then these are the categories I was talking about. So, you have ability terms, aggrandizing terms, class terms. There's even some British terms, criminal justice terms, it goes through, but you just have to know that you have various categories, right? I will also be placing the output in this folder. So let's pop in a terminal. Early versions of Marmat were completely run in terminal using Python, but recent developments from their team have created GUIs or graphic user interfaces for both PC and Mac. But in order to open that GUI, first you need to use terminal, or if you're in PC, or if you use PCs, command prompt to navigate to the primary Python file. So first I will navigate there. And I know it's in my Marmat folder, and I know that the primary Python file is in the source code folder. So then you need to open the GUI by typing Python 3, which is telling your terminal to run the third version of Python against whatever the main Python file is. And if you see, I can even show you in the source code, there's the main.python file, right? Okay. Great. So you just hit enter, give it a second. It's thinking, great. And here is Marmat. Okay, so I recommend when you first download and run Marmat, you navigate through all these options. But for now, let's simply run the program and look at the output. So you're going to select Run Marmat. Next, you're going to load your metadata. So we know all of that is in this folder. Everything looks good. Make sure that your columns and your data looks the way you want it. Next, you're going to load your lexicon. So we know that's also in the same folder, right? Yet again, make sure that the columns and the terms look the way you want them to. Now we're in the configure analysis page. So this is where you'll select the column that will function as the unique identifier, what columns you want Marmat to analyze against the lexicon terms, and what categories in the lexicon you want to run the metadata against. So for this demo, we will be using ID as the unique identifier. As you can see, it defaults to the first column, which is always helpful. And then we're going to select title, abstract, and transcription to analyze. Lastly, we'll select what categories to run against. This is helpful to think about as it will limit the number of false positives you have to work through in the output. So for this metadata, which covers American activities from 1950 to 1990, we're actually going to remove the British terms, slavery terms, and Japanese incarceration terms. So then once you've made all these decisions, you can hit next. Now we're going to select the name and location of the output file. So as I've mentioned, like to put everything in the same folder. I also find it helpful to add dates, right, to your output file so that you know when you ran it exactly. So hit save, great. And now we will hit perform analysis. So you'll see that progress bar. Eventually a view of the output CSV file, as you can see here, is created, but you will also find that in the folder we selected. So we'll hit finish because we know the file is created, and there it is in the output, right? So let's just open that and look at it really quickly. All right, so here's the output. It's organized by the item identifier. There's the term that was present from your lexicon. That's the category in the lexicon. That's the column title or metadata element that's present in, and then here's the text from that element, right? So the term important, which is considered an aggrandizement term, was present in the title of this item, and here's the text in the title that shows that, right? So important sites related to Black history is right there. Okay, so now let's pop back in the presentation to discuss the initial analysis of this output. I don't think it's a secret to say that I pre-analyzed this so that I could give you guys some thoughtful analysis and talk about the review framework we have locally developed. Okay. So the initial results are the tool flagged 486 lexicon terms across 281 records. So that's nearly half the records that we tested. This substantial presence of flagged language indicates possible systemic issues requiring review. We don't currently have time in this discussion, in this lecture, to discuss inherent bias in AI description, but if you'd like to know more about and a more detailed analysis I did of this, don't hesitate to ask at the end of the presentation. There's also a link in that list of links to a paper myself and Sarah Sweeney wrote about analyzing a similar set of data from AI-generated metadata. So of the flagged terms, 182 originated from the photograph transcriptions. So language embedded in the images themselves, right? The remaining 304 terms came from the titles and abstracts. Okay, so let's talk about the review framework that we've adapted. We've adapted it from Duke University's Rubenstein Library Audit Manual, which is also in the links. And by adapted, I really mean that we made very small changes to it and then used that framework to establish our own local framework, which is the categories you see below. We start by going through, and for each flagged item, we document the term originator. So was the term originated by someone in the group described, outside of that group described, or was it catalogger or AI generated? Then we review the usage context. So is it in a proper noun? Is it directly quoted from the source material? Is it a paraphrase from that source language? Or is it originated by the cataloger, or is it used only by the cataloger in the narrative description? Last but not least, we choose impact assessment. So is it a false positive? So like a neutral term flagged incorrectly. One example of this is one of the terms that is present in the lexicon is colored, and we had that flagged a lot for like yellow colored shirt was something that got flagged a lot. So that would be a false positive. There's also many times where a term maybe mentions a marginalized issue or identity neutrally. There are also moments where you might be uncertain about the use of the term. We had some output that was using what possibly could have been a proper noun, but it required more research for us to review whether or not that was actually the name of something. So that would be when we would mark it as uncertain. Then there's when it explicitly is downplaying bias, when it uses dehumanizing language, or when it has aggrandizement of oppressors. Different combinations of this lead to different categorizations, right? So of course, no matter what the term originator and usage context, the impact assessment, if it's a false positive, we would put that at the category of 1, right? So then later on, you'll skip those when you're remediating this metadata. Category 2 is really, as I mentioned, when you're uncertain of the proper impact type, and it requires more research. So that leads to a different workflow. Categories 3 and 4 are things that are based on a combination of the Rubenstein framework options, right? So for example, out group tends to move things up to a 4, whereas in group it might move to a 2 or a 3, depending on the usage context. But if you select downplaying bias, dehumanizing language, or aggrandizement of individual or institution, that almost always puts it in categories 3 or 4. So once the impact assessment is done and the categories are selected, that's when we decide how much remediation that record requires. So let's look at a quick example of what this looks like with an item and metadata. Okay, so sorry, displaying spreadsheet data is always a little awkward. I'm going to give everyone a minute to take a look before I start to discuss what you see here. Okay. A couple things to think about. As you can see, the same term was used in all three fields for the item I'm showing you, right? So, and that's the term riot, right? So this term's use in the title and abstract are probably due to the presence of it in the transcription. And although the term was flagged as just the term, you can see by reading through the description that it kind of shows a generally biased understanding of events. So what do I mean by that? Well, the title says Black woman runs from police. I would say that's not something I see here. That indicates a level of civil disobedience that I don't necessarily see displayed. Throughout the description, the race of the woman is discussed, but not any of the policemen or other people around her. In the abstract, you'll see the use of the word distressed, which seems subjective. A moment of tension and unrest. It feels very euphemistic in description. And debris litters the street. I'm not sure if that is a justified level of detail, and I think it is kind of indicating like a level of unrest that I'm not sure I see displayed in the photograph. So all of this adds up to like a harmful representation of this moment captured in this photograph. So if you go back to the framework, you'll see that according to the Rubenstein framework, that the term was selected by the outgroup original cataloger. It's present in the transcription, right? But it's used in the title and abstract without quoting the original resource or providing context for the term. So it's really kind of paraphrasing and/or AI narrative. And it really leads to dehumanizing the person and the group represented and downplaying bias in the image. So this really leads this to be a category 4 record, which would require a total rewrite of this description. So, I mean, a little bit of cataloger or human intervention would provide context, right? So just so that you understand what's happening in the image, on June 2nd, 1967, a group called Mothers for Adequate Welfare held a sit-in at the Grove Hall Welfare Office in Roxbury, and it was staged to protest inequalities in welfare benefit distribution. Roughly 30, mostly Black women, were protesting these oppressive welfare policies. When police arrived at the scene, they stormed the building where the sit-in was taking place and began to harass, attack, and arrest protesters, including students and mothers. So does the information in the description represent this history? No. I think from knowing a little bit about how the AI description works and from analyzing the larger data set, the use of the word riot in the transcription led to a host of additional assumptions about what was happening in the image that cascaded to a largely biased description of events. But if you look at historic descriptions of this event, such as like news sources at the time, you'll see a similarly biased understanding. So it wouldn't be outlandish to assume that you might see the same level of descriptive bias in older archival or project descriptions. Okay. All right, so we're skipping the additional analysis of this data set for the sake of time, but if you have questions about the output of this specific test, what the analysis revealed about the AI-generated descriptions, please don't hesitate to ask at the end of this presentation. All right, so what sort of considerations need to be made when thinking about how to build your own workflow using this tool? First off, you really need to think about customizing the lexicon for your project context, right? So start with Marmat's pre-curated reparative lexicon. I find it to be very thorough. They also update it regularly, so you want to check the site to make sure you have the most updated and extensive version. But I cannot recommend enough adding terms specific to your collections and project needs. So what does that look like? Considering regional language variations and historical terminology specific to your holdings. And I cannot recommend enough adding those as new categories that are project specific so that you can make tool use as straightforward as possible when selecting categories to run your metadata against. I also think establishing collaborative review procedures is really important. So we find the Rubenstein framework and our group review really helpful. I'm not saying you have to follow that exactly, but I really don't think you should rely on a single reviewer. I think it both builds in bias and creates burnout in that individual. As I've said, if you don't use the Rubenstein, I still think a structured review framework is really helpful, especially having clear categories for assessment so that your multiple reviewers can have consistent criteria. Scheduling regular consensus discussion for difficult or uncertain cases is also something we found to be really helpful. And lastly, I recommend rotating reviewers whenever possible to distribute the emotional labor and gain wider perspectives. Lastly, I really think you need to think about balancing historical preservation with ethical description, right? So this in general is an ongoing tension in historic and archival work, right? You want to represent materials and confront histories while trying to reduce harm. And so how you go about doing this is really consider your user community and mission when trying to make decisions about how to assess metadata. So different intended users and project goals might lead to different descriptive responses in the same material. I also cannot recommend enough documenting this decision-making rationale and being transparent about this approach, both with other people in your institution and if possible via public-facing documentation. Okay, a couple practical implementation tips. Build in time for setting up this work. It's a new kind of remediation and it takes time to set up effectively, right? So you really, as I can stress several times, need to prepare documentation and create a stable team. If possible, you want to create an analysis framework that functions for the needs of the project, but can also be edited or repurposed for future work and new information. Lastly, I think it's really important to consider which portions of the collection and/or projects are priorities for testing and analysis, right? You want to start small, pilot with one subset before you scale up. And that's because your review will be iterative, right? You'll refine your approach as you learn, which means you may need to return to your initial analysis. Okay, we're almost done here. You've learned, you've researched, you've collaborated, you've created living documentation, you've applied that documentation using tools, and you've analyzed the output based on established framework. So what does this look like as a long-term practice? Sustainable practices for long-term success are really about how you set up and maintain this work to make sure it's properly supported and feasible in the long term, right? So you really want to make sure that you incorporate self-care guidance for your staff. So you want to build in permission to take breaks when working with difficult material, you want team debriefing sessions, and you want resources on vicarious trauma and trauma-informed practice. I find it really helpful to frame it as an institutional responsibility, not just individual, so that someone doesn't feel like they're failing if they find the work especially challenging. You also really want to partner across your institution and, if possible, with outside communities. So, work with your colleagues in other departments, such as, my department works with special collections and archives and resource and descriptive access and the digital scholarship group. Engage with your public services staff, if possible, to hear user feedback and or try to do user studies at some point. And then I really do think it's important to involve administrators whenever possible to secure resources and an institutional level commitment. And then, community partnerships. If possible, I think it's good to recognize that community members are experts in their own representation. So if you partner on community-engaged reparative projects, they will help you identify issues and possible solutions, but I do think it's really important to be transparent about your project limitations when engaging with the larger community. Don't promise more than you can deliver, right? And lastly, I think staying current with evolving terminology and best practices is really essential to long-term sustainability, right? Language and community preferences change over time. So do things like subscribe to relevant listservs and working groups, revisit your documentation periodically. My department really likes to build in regular review cycles for our documentation, so annual or biannual check-ins. We also tend to re-review documentation as new projects emerge, or discuss document functionality with new staff and community members, because I really do think that's an excellent stress test to the functionality of your documentation. Whenever possible, share this documentation with the professional community that you work with. I've gotten really great feedback from other professionals in this field about how to improve our local documentation. And lastly, attend presentations and workshops like this one. Okay, a couple final thoughts. Metadata, cataloging, description, it's not neutral, right? The choices we make in information organization shape who feels welcome in our collections and projects and how history is understood. The goal is to work toward more equitable and accurate representation of all communities in our collections. So if neutrality isn't possible, inclusive and reparative practices are essential parts of descriptive work, not extra. But learning and implementing it takes time. So approach learning and applying these principles in a manageable way and lean on the larger library, archives, digital humanities community to gain knowledge and skills. People are doing this work and they want to share it with you. Okay. Always feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, concerns, or desires to collaborate. My general goal is to establish a community of practice at Northeastern, and I would love for people to join in this work. Okay. That's what I got for you.
Great, thank you. That was really wonderful to hear. I now want to just open it up. Well, first I'm going to pause and say we are going to stop recording before the Q&A. So we'll stop that now, but then we're going to turn to the, sort of